Welcome to the Climate and Coordination Rcast, where every week we'll be discussing topics related to all things climate change and RChain's role in the solution. We will be discussing technologies that can adapt and coordinate massive amounts of data like never before, forming social architectures that grow collective intelligence, sharing and evaluating data planetarily, all while maintaining personal privacy and personal data ownership. A new decentralized economy is forming as we move from the third industrial revolution, digitization, to the fourth, decarbonization. By building a co-op, built on a correct by construction, concurrent, scalable solution, RChain is structured to build out the new technology that will be required for a flourishing regenerative planet. Please join us on this journey.
Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to the Climate and Coordination Rcast. Today we have a number of different things we wanted to discuss that we thought might be interesting and relevant. Obviously, we are experiencing a moment of unrest on top of unrest with these global protests, and there's also, we're still dealing with the coronavirus, so it's very unrestful time, and we might talk a little bit about that a little later. But anyway, the first article that I have here, I've researched quite a lot this past week to try to find some interesting and apropos pieces. Obviously, we're still in a climate crisis. We're still in the sixth mass extinction. All of these things are still going on amidst this pandemic and all of these protests, and I think it's really important to remember that. Anyway, this is a pretty interesting kind of interactive map that I found from a website called Global Witness. This is actually from August of 2019, but even though it's several months old, I think it's pretty interesting to look at what is going to happen with energy around the world. This is basically, I'll put this in the chat. This is, well, I can just read from it. Here we go. It says, the U.S. is set to drown the world in oil. A staggering 61% of the world's new oil and gas production over the next decade is set to come from one country alone, the United States. So there's basically a few different little charts and maps here showing from 2020 to 2029 how much oil the United States, new oil production the United States is going to be responsible for around the world. And obviously, we talk a lot on this call about how, we're turning a corner, public opinion is changing, the price of oil went to negative. All of these things are happening, and yet there's still a lot of information out there that points to basically two different potential futures, I think, is what I'm seeing. One of them is the one that's outlined in this report from Global Witness, and the sources on these charts are from a place called Rystad Energy. Anyway, and then the other potential future, I guess, is one where we pull back a lot on how much oil we're going to extract. And obviously, this article points out that the next U.S. president is going to need to have a plan for this. How are we going to decide what path we're going to go down, and how are we going to coordinate obviously away from this huge tragedy. But anyway, this is a really fascinating little piece, and I really enjoyed the different sources it had, and the interactive maps, which show in billions of barrels, not only around the world where the oil is going to come from in the next 10 years, but also within the United States, obviously Texas being a leader. In Pennsylvania following in second place. So anyway, we have a real crossroads kind of thing happening here. And even Jane Goodall, who's one of my personal heroes, came out with a piece last week that basically highlighted this, and she said, more or less, since coronavirus has happened, the world has a chance to come together and figure out what we're going to do about not only the climate but about basically our own self-preservation. Are we going to keep cutting down forests? Are we going to keep agitating the natural world and kind of inviting these diseases into our cities? Are we going to keep overproducing, overspending, over everything? And she said, basically, if we don't figure it out after coronavirus, then we're kind of toast. So I definitely think we're at a crossroads. And I, as much as I pay attention to the climate news and energy discussions and reports and stuff, I actually didn't realize how much this global oil production within the next 10 years was potentially going to come to the United States. It's really stunning to see how much the U.S. is trying to do this. It says that the new U.S. production is forecast to be 20 times that of Russia and more than 1.5 times the total of all other countries combined. So this is a really serious amount of oil. But there's also other information out there that points to a different potential future. So obviously we're at the crossroads, which I mentioned. So maybe Daryl, if you would like to, maybe you could mention some of the research that you found, because we definitely have some different options as a nation and a world going forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Nora.
Of course.
Yeah, this is it. We are at a crossroads. We are at a pivot point. And it's really clear, and that article really kind of stresses that. So basically, if life as we know it on the planet is to survive, that new oil that's poised to dominate the world over the next 10 years, that new oil has to stay in the ground. And
that's correct. Yes.
And so the article, it like you pointed out, it came out in August of last year, which is like a lifetime away.
Right, highly different situation, exactly, but
yeah,
still potentially relevant, though.
Oh, hugely relevant because it points out the important thing that we need to face. But I think that a lot more hope has arisen since August of 2019, despite all of this tragedy that's been happening, and some as a result of the tragedy that's been happening. But what this article says to me is that there's no question that the future of the planet depends on what the United States does. The U.S., due to fracking innovations over the next 10 years, will rapidly become the vastly largest supplier of oil in the world. The U.S. has built its empire on oil. As Johan Galtung has said, empires rise and fall around an energy source. So, the representation of U.S. power is Texas tea, black gold. And thanks to fracking, America again is sitting on the largest reserve of the energy source that fueled its influence over the world, and made America great. Trump won an election using the slogan, "Make America Great Again." And his platform is clearly built around accelerating and amplifying the world's desire towards the use of that energy source, while directly denying climate change. So a major phase shift has to occur in the United States if the planet is to survive. And the reality is this: the US needs to develop a national self-awareness, a realization that though they may be sitting on the largest of the world's supply of oil, they must not work towards promoting its use, and in fact, move the other way. This will involve a massive shift in collective thought as a nation. It will involve a reckoning that if the U.S. wants to maintain its stature in global leadership, it must move to another energy resource, despite the fact that it is repositioned as the primary source of oil. It will have to defy Johan Galtung's theory, based on all other historic precedent, that empires rise and fall around an energy source. The U.S. will have to migrate from one energy source to another and in the process, change the notion of empire altogether, because this will be a global undertaking involving unprecedented cooperation and coordination amongst all nations. The world needs to believe in the United States as the nation that can wake up from itself, become collectively self-aware as a nation, and go through a radical transformation that will represent a phase shift for humanity. And you will need help from the rest of the world to do this. So I believe that this phase shift has begun. As we've mentioned in previous calls, the banking and finance industry has spoken here in 2020. Oil is not as viable an investment as renewables. The pivot actually has already occurred. Fossil fuel companies are no longer the main drivers of the economy. So if you are so inclined to follow the money when thinking of who will be placed in power at the next election, it looks like Trump placed his bets in the wrong basket. So I'd like to point out 3 recent articles that present hope.
Yeah, also, could you just tell us which one you were reading from just now?
Oh, this was just my talk.
Oh, that was all you.
Yeah, this was just my thoughts last night that I was putting together for this.
Oh, wow. Yeah, no,
call.
I just noticed that it sounded like you were reading. So, wow, that's the wonderful writing.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so yeah, I was reading, but I was reading from my notes. So so here's another article from The Guardian yesterday that supports the idea that fossil fuel industry is on its way out. So the plunging cost of wind and solar marks turning point in energy transition. So I think this is from yesterday. Plunging costs of renewables mark a turning point in a global transition to low carbon energy, with new solar or wind farms increasingly cheaper to build than running existing coal plants. The International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, said that the attractive prices of renewables relative to fossil fuel power generation could help governments embrace green economic recoveries from the shock of the coronavirus pandemic. We have reached an important turning point in the energy transition, Francesco La Camera, Director General of IRENA, said in a statement. Although scientists say the world needs to stage a much faster transition to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, the annual report by Abu Dhabi-based agency shows that wind and solar are increasingly competitive on price alone. So it's the money has spoken. It's cheaper than fossil fuels. We still need to solve the base load problem. But that seems to there's tons of money being put into solving that problem, and I believe it will be solved in the next 5 to 10 years. So that was one article of hope. Another one, this is from The Guardian. Coronavirus crisis could cause $25 trillion fossil fuel industry collapse. So not only shortly before coronavirus hit, the major banks and finance companies announced that oil is no longer a viable investment. Coronavirus itself has accelerated that decline. So this article says the value of reserves could fall by 2/3 as COVID-19 hastens the peak in demand. Let's see here. The coronavirus outbreak could trigger a $25 trillion collapse in the fossil fuel industry by accelerating a terminal decline for the world's most polluting companies. The studies found that the value of the world's fossil fuel reserves could fall by 2/3 sooner than the industry expects because the COVID-19 crisis has hastened the peak for oil, gas, and coal demand. I'll just skip the rest of it, but the article basically, just reinforces that idea. And so the third sign of hope is related to potentially the next president. So the article from August 2019, at that time, Biden was not the Democratic candidate, so there was kind of a lot in that article that was focused on who it's going to be. But now that we know that Biden is the guy, we have a better idea of what things could look like if he becomes president in November. And Biden has pledged not to spend any money on new oil developments. He claimed he will ban fracking, although the jury is still out on whether he'll actually do that. That could be very difficult to pull off, but kind of has to happen. And he claims to embrace the Green New Deal and has a plan for a clean energy revolution, investing $1.7 trillion, making record-breaking investments in clean energy technologies.
Who wrote that?
That is from an article in The Hill. Here,
I don't believe that those statements about Joe Biden are correct. But okay. I could be wrong, but I think that's a very optimistic view of what he has promised to do.
Okay. What do you what were you thinking?
Well, thank you for all of that, all of those different articles. I think that it's a really interesting dichotomy that we have here. Looking at these two kind of forecasts of what's going to happen. One thing I wanted to mention before we get to any individual political ideology is that I think it's problematic for the United States to only pick or to usually pick the energy resource that's the cheapest and have ethics and morality not involved in the way that we power our lifestyles, whether that the energy source is slavery, which was highly unethical, or prison labor, which is still going on, which is, we use prison labor to fight the wildfires and make all sorts of products. A lot of people have criticism against that. Also, the use of people's data without their permission and the surveillance capitalism economy, which we're also still living through. So, I'm really happy that we are transitioning to greener energy and that people are seeing it as a cheaper option because it is cheaper. But the other thing I think is important that people don't really discuss that it's immoral to stay with the fossil fuel economy, that we have so many people, usually impoverished people, that live so close to these energy sources, for example, and they get sick, or that the way in which these companies treat their workers is usually reckless. There's a lot of explosions, the oil spills. There's a huge oil spill in Russia that occurred yesterday or the day before, which we could get into, but they hardly got any press because of everything else that's going on. So anyway, I just think it's important that we talk about what are the ethical energy source. Obviously, green energy is much more ethical than dirty energy, but I don't think that America has a very good track record at all of picking what is most ethical. And luckily now, because the green energy technology is getting so much more sophisticated, people are starting to realize that it's the best of both worlds, more ethical. We can create better jobs with it without polluting the planet and hopefully without causing as much health and human harm to people creating it, but also because it's cheaper. So I just wanted to mention that because cheaper is just only one. It's obviously, since America is the capitalist superpower right now, potentially falling, obviously it's important to us to save money, but I just wanted to point out that's not the only thing in life is to save money. But about Joe Biden, not that we have to get super deep into politics, but I have seen multiple times video of him disagreeing with young climate protesters or just people that ask him on the street or at a campaign event if he supports the Green New Deal. He says things like, get real, or, then don't vote for me or whatever. And so I don't see him as a supporter of a Green New Deal. I do see him, obviously, as it comes to energy, as a way better option than Trump. Obviously, that goes without saying. But I have not seen him make any public statements that are nearly as sweeping or emergent as other candidates like Bernie Sanders and other people did. So I'm hoping that he will exceed the goals that he's set out if he wins, but I'm a little skeptical about that.
Yeah, I think it's important to remain skeptical. I don't think he's going to be like, perfect.
But we have to be careful, right? I mean, so I applaud your skepticism, but it's one thing for Joe Biden to not necessarily support the new Green Deal, and another thing for Joe Biden to be to pledge to be against fracking, right? So those two are not equivalent, right? And
That's correct, right?
As good, as good scientists, good engineers, good musicians. We want to be, clear-headed, and make sure that we don't fall prey to that kind of logical fallacy. but I think one of the things that feels like the elephant in the room in this discussion is, if we think that there was a tinderbox, I mean, this is exactly the situation that we're in with the police brutality, clearly documented with video evidence from all the major mainstream news sources, or I don't know, mainstream is maybe not the right term, but all of the accepted.
Everybody's documented it. Everybody.
And this is exactly what I and many people have said for the last 10 years. I've been pointing to the fact that billions of dollars of military equipment and then military training has gone into the U.S. police force. Meaning that the way they handle situations is not the way they used to handle them. I mean, I guess the police chief in Michigan was a notable exception, but but by and large, the way they handle these situations only exacerbates the violence, and is at directly at odds with the U.S. constitutional. The rights given to individuals for freedom of assembly within the Constitution. So the point I'm trying to make is, if we think that the situation was a tinderbox because we militarized the police force, that was one of the many factors that goes into the analysis of what's going to happen unless we get things, unless we find another path. And what we need to look at is the other aspects of this perfect storm are the economic conditions and supply chain conditions that were created because of COVID. All right, so 40 million Americans, is that right, are out of work?
Looks like it, yeah.
So many of them are facing very dire situations as a result of the way the virus was handled in this country. And so if there is a spark, such as the George Floyd death, which was awful, then they are going to respond. They're going to feel the need to respond, and if the police respond in this predictable manner, then we're going to have the situation that we have, and it was entirely predictable. But what you have to, when you're talking about climate change in this context, we have to look at the fact that what happens when the Midwest, the U.S. Midwest, looks like Australia did at the end of last year.
Yeah, I mean, the chances of us having a kind of dust bowl country, much like the Great Depression, is very high now. And that's going to, I mean, what you're really talking about, Greg, I think, is just like compounding social, political, and environmental emergencies, each one making the next one more difficult to mitigate and more difficult to navigate in a just and equitable way.
That's exactly right. And it's going to happen. It's no longer avoidable.
Well, it's already, I mean, we're already, I think it's already happening. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is happening, but the point is it's going to get much worse. Much worse. And so
right.
the situation that we've seen over the last few days is just the very tip of the iceberg. And so we are going to see massive breakdown in the social order. And
yeah.
And this is why we have to build alternative coordination, because we won't be able to rely upon the existing coordination mechanisms.
Well, and yes, and just to insert another interesting perspective on this, there are a lot of really outstanding activists and thinkers, people like Angela Davis, Cornel West, other people that I've been really studying a lot over the past few days, especially, but also over many years. And what a lot of them talk about is that racism is really harming our ability not only to solve the climate crisis, because we leave so many people out, especially there's a poll that I read that Black people care more about the climate crisis than white people. And apparently Latino people care the most about the climate crisis. That's an interesting thing. They're the most urgently concerned. So obviously we need those people to be working in science and research and development and all these things. But racism is also harming our ability to coordinate on other things, like, dealing with, for example, coronavirus and other, calamities that affect people's ability to work and to live. Like when we leave out huge parts of the economy, of course, that can be women, did not used to work. And so we've basically built this country without an idea to include everybody, and so the social contract, as you mentioned, started in America, completely broken. And so now we're trying to get to a point where I feel like we can possibly function on the level that we need to in order to address all this stuff for all of us. So that's something that I've been really thinking about lately, is how racism affects our ability to take care of one another and to take care of ourselves. And I guess a lot of people in this country and around the world, obviously racism is not a new thing. Sexism is not a new thing. All sorts of different types of prejudice. People possibly just didn't realize that harms them. You know what I mean? That harms them. So it doesn't just harm the other person, So, this idea that America's social contract has broken down or is breaking down, I think is a very interesting idea, because, America didn't really start as a democracy. It started as kind of an imperialist experiment that morphed into kind of an empire. And now finally, I think we have signs of a democracy, but I don't really think that we're fully in that. And, obviously there's been reports about how unsafe America is for journalists, for example, now. And, so we have a lot of work to get to a democracy. And then obviously then you get to the idea that there's a lot of people that don't even think we should have a democracy or capitalism. We should organize ourselves a different way. So all of this stuff, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's going to get worse. But the coordination technology has to get better, because we are trying to pull together all these disparate threads of society, politics, climate. All of this stuff needs to come together if we're going to survive. So it's quite an interesting situation, I would say.
Yeah, and a lot of it was predicted, right? I've been looking at the situation, very, very aware of the risks for a very long time. It's been at least 10 years that I've been watching the situation with the police force, going, wow, this is going to erupt, and it's only a matter of time unless we have a serious change. And I mean, one of the balancing forces has been the the growth of social media. Right, with social media, it's impossible, even when the police turn off their body cams for the acts of brutality, to be hidden. So that's just no longer something that can that can be hidden. And so
that's the biggest change. Everybody's got cameras, so everyone's actually seeing what's going on.
Right, but the
When you
scariest.
say the police, in the U.S. there are many different police jurisdictions. There's no central authority for the police. There's no one organization that oversees all of the police, and the standards for policing are set by a consortium of like, I don't know, about 12 different law enforcement organizations, like the Fraternal Order of Police or IAD or NAPPO. I mean, there are a whole bunch of them. So we don't really have strong standards, and there's no, it's not a centralized thing when you're talking about policing in the US. And there are some jurisdictions that are really good, that do lots of sensitivity training and advise on, proper use of force. So we're not talking about just one thing. It's not black and white.
no, I agree with you 100%, and I'm certainly not trying to demonize the police force. They do good work, but the pressure when you've got billions of dollars of equipment pouring into these organizations, the pressure is enormous, right? And once you get the equipment, then you have to have the training to use the equipment. And that's the mechanism by which the culture of force becomes transmitted.
Look at the root of it. The root of it is, they justify this escalation of arms because everyone in the U.S. has got a gun.
Yes.
These people are at huge risk all the time. They're scared. It's a dangerous job.
Yeah. No,
it is, and I think another tragedy is that a lot of them don't care if they are being filmed either by somebody else or with their own body cams, and that's why we see so much violence. And another thing, and well, we shouldn't just say violence; they're murders, obviously. But another aspect of this that I was not aware of until very recently, and but I've been getting into it, is the history of the police really goes back to slave patrols, and a lot of people don't know that. So there's this big question about why despite there not being an overarching national police authority that I know of, because police are run by each different city or state, why is there such a common thread of white supremacy in policing? And you have to look back at these slave patrols and look at how these things evolve over time. It's not like any new thing now. So hopefully there can be some really serious reforms, and obviously there are definitely police that want to reform, and that's great. That's really powerful and really important. But the history of this is not something that just occurs in the last few years, just with the body cameras. Greg, did you want to say something?
Sorry, no, I had to step away for 1 second. Was there?
That's okay. That's fine. Yeah. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do, and I agree with Greg that the sending of all of this military equipment to the police to further militarize the police doesn't ease things up at all. And there's a lot of speculation about why it is in other countries that the police don't kill hardly anybody. And I think another discussion to be had, which relates to climate, relates to coordination, relates to all this stuff, is why is it that the U.S. doesn't invest in things that keep people peaceful and healthy and safe, like health infrastructure, like education, all these things that would cause us to have a more peaceful society and cause people to be a lot less financially desperate. We deal with things that way, because when you have a society of healthy, healthy, peaceful people who are able to take care of themselves and their families, you're not going to have as many, violent conflicts. You're not going to have as much unrest as you do now when people are really desperate. They're desperate from coronavirus. They're desperate because they don't have health care. They're desperate, from high housing prices. People are trying to earn money. People are trying to take care of their families. It's not always that people just set out and try to become criminals. A lot of people are just in a very desperate situation. And I think if we as a nation invested more in, these very simple programs, that we wouldn't need as much police, as much policing. So there's that.
Yeah. So I think again, to some of Daryl's points, the one of the things that we can do effectively is to help with, grassroots, grounds up kind of coordination. I think communities can organize themselves. So if we think about, the various protest organizations, they need to be able to plan things in a way that that handles the reality of the situation on the ground. So when people go to protest, they need to be, aware that if they're in certain locations, they can be kettled by the police. If they're in, if they can hand out gas masks so they can, be they can remain peaceful and yet not be so affected by the tear gas and the pepper bombs. Those kinds of things. So there's real coordination that can happen even if you're talking about a peaceful protest. And so Twitter is a possibility, Facebook is a possibility, but if you don't trust those organizations because they are centralized and because they have in the case of Zuckerberg, they have made statements or taken positions that make it clear that their values are not aligned with the kinds of directions that we'd like to see the country go in. Then something more decentralized that can be managed and controlled by a community begins to make a lot more sense. And that's where, RChain and being able to, put a chat kind of capability on top of a blockchain, which RChain makes available, suddenly becomes of higher utility. So I just wanted to connect the conversation back to some of the things that Daryl was talking about, and so within RChain, we've had this this idea for a long time of having social media wedded to the blockchain so that you could have real decentralized social coordination and social dialogue. And we've put forward this idea of an architecture that's robust enough and scalable enough that you can actually put the data on chain. And the reason that's important, of course, is because unless you do that, then you're back into the situation where the salient data, the data that Facebook wants to collect, which is all of the commentary and and the sentiment associated by a crowd, is actually or by a community, is actually on centralized servers behind a firewall. But if you put the data on chain, that's no longer the case. And so RChain, as early as 2018, the fall of 2018, was demonstrating that you could put very large amounts of data on chain, even prior to any of the wallet kinds of functionality, the payments network functionality. So we could do that, over 2 years ago, and we can still do that at scale. And so it makes sense to take, an open source communications capability like the Zulip chat program and wed that to the RChain blockchain. So now you get a basic on-chain chat capability, which can be used for coordinating communities, such as those who want to organize peaceful protests, or those who want to, take other kinds of action, like cleaning up the oceans. And part of what can happen is that you can not only do what Facebook does, or what Twitter does, or Instagram does, which is store the data of the communications online, but you can begin to tokenize some of those communication acts. So you can.
The tokenization can be around such things as fundraising. It can be around reputation. You can use tokenization also for voting. So it would provide, and Zulip is just a generic version of Slack. So if you can imagine a group moving to create their own Slack-like group, they can mint a token. With that token, they can use that to monetize or to vote, or to give credit for people's contributions in other ways, like time credits, score reputation, all of this in a way which is secure, where people's personal information isn't being mined or shared outside of their consent. So this is what we're talking about, right?
That's exactly what we're talking about.
I've got a question though about, might get a little too geeky here, but what about when you have such a group set up, how would RChain support like some kind of federation between these groups?
Well, one of the simplest sorts of things is just sharding, right? So each group could be its own shard, and then the federation of shards is really wiring up the shards into a tree. So that's one of the simplest approaches. You can be as fancy as you want. I think Daryl had a similar question where he was asking, how does the blockchain decide, what data goes on to the chain? Well, the blockchain doesn't decide that. That's entirely up to the rules that you put above that. So that's why I've been talking a lot about that. It's not just the blockchain technologies, right? There's a whole layer of other technologies that sit above the blockchain, right? The blockchain, to make this more concrete, the blockchain doesn't make any comments about who pays what to whom, right? It doesn't know whether or not this transaction happens because there was an ethical exchange, or if the gains were ill-gotten. And the blockchain technology does nothing to address or enforce anything like that.
It's more like a database.
Yeah, it's more like a database, or and so in order to put together support for those that next layer of sensibilities and concerns, that's another layer of technology, and it's not just bits and bytes. It's also social technology. So I know that I've been talking quite a bit here, but I wanted to hear Daryl and Nora weigh in on these things, and whether or not it resonates or lands with them in terms of the wider context we've been talking about.
Well, for me, this connects to an article that I was actually going to bring up that also came out this week. And it's an article about an employee from Facebook that left, and why he left. And the thing that kind of really hit me in the article was one of the last sentences where the employee, I can't remember his first name, Aveni, is his last name, but he said, "I think Zuckerberg is scared to take action when it really, really matters. And that concerns me because I don't know how many chances we have to do the right thing anymore. I think we're seeing the country go down a really, really dangerous path." And what hit me there is that, first of all, Facebook's extremely top down. When it was apparently literally up to Mark Zuckerberg to make the decision of whether to pull that Donald Trump violent quote down or not. So that's amazing. And so it begs the question, how does correct decision making get done on a blockchain? And it has to involve some type of community. And how can that community make the right decisions? And this is something that Jim White's covered, talks about so often. But one concern is that if there isn't an intelligent, compassionate, ethical community structure, then we could descend into more of a mobocracy form of decision making, which I don't know if that would be much better than Mark Zuckerberg's decision. And so it to me, there's so many questions, like how do we solve this?
Well, I think you've really you put your finger on a lot of important questions. I mean, I'm much more on the side of free speech. I'd much more Trump be painted with all of the rhetoric that he has put out into the public. I think that makes it clearer and clearer and clearer who he is, right? His speech acts and his acts of governance, make it very clear who he is, and it becomes harder and harder for Trump to hide who he is.
Yeah, good point. I mean, like if Mark Zuckerberg did take that statement down, then we wouldn't have seen it.
Correct. Yeah. Right. Exactly. And on the other hand, and so one of the principles that there are two principles that I used as a part of the founding of RChain. One was radical inclusion, and the other is radical transparency. So you want to include all viewpoints, because you never know, from which corner a solution to a problem might come. On the other hand, we have all seen in RChain how painful that process can be when you have when you have people who demonstrate really bad intent, or demonstrate a kind of dysfunction that is actually malignant. Then you're faced with the fact that the communication channels themselves are resources, and if people poison those resources, if they degrade or destroy those channels, then the community is at risk, because they can't use the channels anymore. So one of the interesting things, though, about a blockchain with communications technology is that we can recognize that communications channels are real resources, and so you have to have fuel in order to utilize those resources. And so a troll, like we've watched on Discord, trolls in RChain just completely destroy particular channels because they suck up all of the space in the channel. They just put out noise upon noise upon noise upon noise, and people just eventually just wander away. Mm-hmm. And so what they've done is they've destroyed the channel. And this is like, you can think of it, from a biological point of view, this is like a viral or a bacteriological attack on an important function or feature of an organism. But if you were to make it so that to recognize that the communication acts actually cost resources, then a troll could have their tantrum. They could do whatever they wanted, but they would eventually just run out of fuel, and they would not be able to. And if you made the giving of fuel a fuel for communication a community function, then they would only get more airtime, more airspace if they could get more fuel from the community. And so that's that. And it's sort of like that, today, people whose message resonates, they get more attention. And when platforms notice that a particular party gets attention, then they give them more access to the platform. But if
became reified in a mechanism, then at least there's something. It doesn't guarantee that difficult viewpoints or very malignant viewpoints won't get airtime. But what it does say is that you'll know which communities are willing to spend resources on which viewpoints, and that becomes a smidgen better, a little bit better. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's the big question that I often ask myself is to what degree does guidance or influence make a role in any blockchain project? It's like, I remember talking to a Montessori teacher. My daughter was going to a Montessori school, and the principal of the school. I come into the school and everyone's just so pleasant and working together, and the kids are, busy doing things and creative, but they're respectful of each other, and it's kind of sane. And and I'm like, how do you do it? And she was just like, well, you just create this environment that fosters this situation. She made it sound so simple, but it instantly conjured back a thought to me of a quote from Lawrence Lessig that's always stuck in my mind from one of his books, where he talks about the four ways that individual behavior is affected in a system, and the four ways are law, market, norms, and architecture. And what she was talking about was architecture. It's designing a system, or designing a flow. I guess architecture means flow of people. So designing a structure that fosters and helps encourage the kind of behavior that's constructive and positive. And so to me, that's kind of the why of RChain, right? It's not simply that we're making this completely it's careful. I have to be careful with my words, but it's not that we're simply making a completely a system that is entirely.
Let me help you. Let me help you out.
Thank you.
It's not crypto anarchist, right? We're not building a crypto anarchist culture, or at least that's not the intent.
Yeah.
The bits will be used in ways that we never anticipated, so that's completely out of our control. But at least with respect to the RChain community, it's really not intended to be a crypto anarchist community. And when you talk about architecture, what comes to my mind, and what I tried to put forward as an example for the RChain community, was the architecture of the circle. In the guitar craft community, or the guitar circle community, it began, before we began to explore forms of movement and motion as a part of performance. It began as a circle, and in a circle, there's no point that is special. At least on the perimeter, right? There's no point on the perimeter that's more favored than any other point. And that architecture is markedly different as a musical architecture from the orchestra and the conductor, right? The orchestra is arranged in such a way that all their attention is focused on the conductor, whereas in the circle, everyone has more or less equal access to the information from everyone else. And that makes a huge difference in terms of what happens to the music. And so this is exactly what is very much supportive of the kind of point you were trying to make, from practical examples that I've had direct experience with. And it's the kind of thing that I would like to see, right? And they're mythological analogs of this that are deep in our culture, right? King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The reason he wanted a round table was so that there wasn't a special point. There wasn't a point of leader, and that was the English myth or metaphor for a shift to a more democratic organization. I wish we could explore this. There's a lot more to say about all of this, but we're 2 minutes before staff meeting, so
yeah, we might have to pick it up again next time because there's a lot to get into.
I think so, but that's good. It's always good to have the Scheherazade principle in operation. People want to hear what happens next.
Exactly. So we'll have to leave on that cliffhanger. Please subscribe to RChain on YouTube, and you can become a member of RChain at rchain.coop. And if you want to be a guest on this call, please don't hesitate to email climate@rchain.coop. Thank you all for a very diverse and interesting conversation today.
Indeed. Thank you.